What happens when the strongest man on the plantation discovers his wife's secret pregnancy was the master's doing? How far would you go if they threatened to sell the only family you had left? On August 15th, 1768, Isaac turned the cotton mill that had broken countless backs into an instrument of justice. 6 plantation masters entered that mill alive. None walked out. This is the story of a man who chose love over life and made the stones of oppression sing a different song. Don't forget to subscribe and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. The mill's stones were still grinding when Master Coleman's screams stopped echoing across Riverside Plantation. Isaac stood between the massive granite wheels, blood splattered across his muscled chest, breathing hard in the humid August air of Mississippi. 6 bodies lay crushed beneath tons of stone and cotton fiber, their fine clothes now indistinguishable from the pulp that would never become cloth. But Isaac wasn't looking at the carnage. His eyes were fixed on the cabin across the field where his wife Miriam waited, carrying the child that had started it all. 3 hours earlier, Isaac had been the most trusted slave on Riverside Plantation. At 6 feet and 4 inches, with arms like tree trunks from years of operating the mill, he was worth more than any 10 field hands. Master Coleman bragged to visitors about Isaac's strength, how he could lift stones that took 4 men to move, how he never missed a day despite the killing heat of the Mississippi summer. Isaac took pride in that strength. It was the only thing in his life that belonged to him, the only thing they couldn't take away. Until today, when he learned they had taken something far more precious. The morning had started like any other. Isaac rose before dawn in the cabin he shared with Miriam, his wife of 3 years. She was still sleeping, her hand resting on the small swell of her belly that had begun to show 2 months ago. Their first child, due in the spring. Isaac had been planning how to ask Master Coleman for extra rations, maybe even permission to build a cradle from mill scraps. He kissed Miriam's forehead and whispered promises about the life they would give their baby, promises that now tasted like ash in his mouth. The mill house stood like a cathedral of labor at the center of Riverside Plantation. 2 massive granite stones, each weighing over a ton, turned day and night during cotton season. The bottom stone lay fixed and grooved, while the top stone, called the runner, crushed cotton bolls into fiber with relentless pressure. Isaac had operated this mill for 7 years, feeding cotton into the eye of the stone, adjusting the gap with precise movements that meant the difference between perfect fiber and ruined crop. His hands knew every vibration, every sound the stones made. Today, they would sing a different song entirely. Master Coleman arrived at the mill with 5 other plantation owners just after sunrise. These men came every month during harvest season, comparing yields and profits while Isaac pretended not to listen. Today's visitors were the usual suspects: Master Bradley from Oak Grove, Master Hensley from White River, Master Morrison from Belle Meade, Master Ashford from Cedar Hill, and Master Dutch from Twin Oaks. 6 men who owned over 3,000 human beings between them. 6 men who had built their fortunes on the backs of families they could separate on a whim. Isaac was adjusting the mill stones when he heard Master Coleman's voice rise above the mechanical grinding. The words made his blood freeze in his veins. "Miriam's carrying my son," Coleman said with a laugh that carried no joy, only ownership. "Been visiting her cabin since Isaac started working nights at the mill. She fights at first, they all do, but they learn." The other masters chuckled appreciatively, as if discussing the weather or crop prices. Isaac's hand stilled on the stone controls. 3 months ago, Coleman had indeed ordered Isaac to work night shifts, claiming they needed to process more cotton before the rains came. Isaac had been grateful for the extra responsibility, proud that his master trusted him with the expensive machinery. Now he understood the real reason. While Isaac labored through the night, Coleman had been forcing himself on Miriam, threatening to sell Isaac south if she resisted. The conversation continued, each word driving deeper into Isaac's chest like mill nails. "The baby will be worth good money when it's old enough," Master Bradley observed. "Light-skinned house servants bring top dollar," Master Hensley nodded agreement. Best to separate the child from the mother early, prevents attachment. Master Coleman's response shattered Isaac's world completely. Already have a buyer lined up. The Richardsons in New Orleans want a baby they can raise proper. Ship leaves next month after the birth. Isaac's vision blurred with rage and grief. They were not just talking about selling his child. They were planning to steal the baby immediately after birth, ship it hundreds of miles away to be raised by strangers who would never know its true parents. Miriam would give birth only to have her arms left empty, while Isaac would watch his bloodline disappear into the vast machinery of slavery that ground families to dust as efficiently as cotton bolls. The mill stones continued their eternal rotation, but Isaac no longer heard them as the sound of work. He heard them as the sound of power, of weight, of finality. Two granite wheels that could crush anything placed between them with the force of falling mountains. For 7 years, he had fed cotton into those stones. Today, he would feed them something different. Master Morrison was explaining his own breeding program when Isaac made his first move. With practiced ease, he adjusted the mill stones closer together, closing the gap until they nearly touched. The grinding sound changed, becoming higher-pitched, more urgent. "Isaac," Coleman barked. "What are you doing? You'll ruin the stones." Isaac turned slowly, his face a mask of calm that belied the storm raging inside. "Just making adjustments, master. Cotton's running thick today." But Isaac wasn't adjusting the stones for cotton. He was preparing them for justice. The gap between the stones was now exactly right for what he had planned. Not tight enough to jam the mechanism, but close enough to crush whatever entered with swift, absolute finality. The masters continued their conversation, unaware that their casual discussion of human livestock had just signed their death warrants. Master Ashford was nearest to the mill opening when Isaac struck. The big man's massive hands grabbed the plantation owner by the shoulders and thrust him headfirst into the gap between the stones before anyone could react. Ashford's scream lasted exactly 2 seconds before the granite wheels caught his skull and crushed it like an eggshell. Blood and brain matter sprayed across the mill house as his body was dragged into the mechanism with the inexorable force of tons of stone. The remaining 5 masters froze in horror, their minds unable to process what they had just witnessed. Isaac used their shock to his advantage, his mill-trained reflexes faster than their gentleman's reflexes. Master Dutch tried to run for the door, but Isaac's long arm caught him by the coat and swung him toward the stones. Dutch managed one terrified "please" before the mill claimed him, his body disappearing into the granite maw with wet, crushing sounds. Master Bradley reached for the pistol at his belt, but his hands shook too badly to draw it clean. Isaac's massive fist connected with Bradley's jaw, sending him stumbling backward into the mill stones. The plantation owner's expensive boots kicked frantically for purchase that would never come as the stones pulled him inexorably downward. His screams joined the grinding chorus until they too were silenced by granite justice. Master Coleman had finally found his voice and was shouting for the overseers, but the mill house stood too far from the main buildings for anyone to hear over the machinery's roar. Master Hensley and Master Morrison backed against the far wall, their faces white with terror as they watched their friend and business partner being crushed to death by the very machine that had made them all wealthy. Isaac advanced on them with the steady pace of the mill stones themselves, unstoppable and final. "Please," Master Morrison gasped, "I have children. I have a wife." Isaac's response was cold as winter rain. "So did I." His hands found Morrison's throat and squeezed until the man's struggles weakened, then fed him to the stones that had no preference between cotton and human flesh. The mill accepted this offering as it had all the others, grinding relentlessly onward. Master Hensley made one last desperate attempt to reason with the giant slave who had become their executioner. "Isaac, listen to me. We can work this out. I'll buy your wife, your child, give you both good homes." But Isaac was beyond reason, beyond fear, beyond everything except the terrible mathematics of revenge. 6 men had planned to destroy his family. 6 men would die in the mill that had enriched them through others' suffering. Master Coleman, the last alive, pressed himself against the mill house wall as Isaac approached. The same man who had bragged about raping Miriam, who had casually planned to sell their newborn child, now wept and begged for mercy he had never shown. Isaac looked at him with eyes that held no hatred, only the finality of grinding stone. "You should have thought about this before you touched my wife," Isaac said quietly, then lifted Coleman like a sack of cotton and fed him to the mill that would be his tomb. The stones continued to turn, now grinding a mixture of cotton, blood, bone, and the fine clothes of 6 plantation masters. Isaac stood alone in the mill house, covered in evidence of his vengeance, listening to the mechanical rhythm that had defined his life. But something had changed in that rhythm. The stones sounded different now, lighter somehow, as if they too were free. Outside, the plantation continued its daily routine, unaware that the 6 most powerful men in the county lay crushed beneath tons of granite. Isaac walked to the mill house door and looked across the fields toward his cabin, where Miriam waited with their unborn child. He had perhaps an hour before someone discovered the carnage, maybe 2 if he was lucky. Time enough to say goodbye, to hold his wife one last time, to whisper promises to the child he would never meet. But as Isaac stepped out of the mill house, he saw something that stopped him cold. Overseer Jenkins was walking directly toward him, drawn by some instinct or chance that had doomed them all. Behind Jenkins came 3 other white men Isaac didn't recognize, visitors perhaps, or buyers come to inspect the plantation's valuable assets. They would reach the mill house in minutes, would discover the bodies, would raise the alarm that would bring every white man in Mississippi down on Isaac's head. Isaac's time had just run out, and the most dangerous part of his story was about to begin. Isaac's mind raced faster than the mill stones as Jenkins and his companions approached. 4 white men meant 4 witnesses, 4 voices that would cry murder across every plantation in Mississippi. But it also meant 4 more problems that needed solving before he could reach Miriam. Isaac ducked back into the mill house, his boots squelching in the mixture of blood and cotton pulp that covered the floor. The grinding stones continued their relentless rotation, now stained red but still functional, still hungry. Jenkins called out as he neared the building. "Isaac, Master Coleman wanted me to check the morning output." Isaac pressed himself against the wall beside the entrance, his massive frame hidden in the shadows. Through the doorway he could see Jenkins' weather-beaten face, the man's hand resting casually on the whip at his belt. Behind him walked 3 strangers in city clothes, probably cotton buyers from New Orleans, come to inspect the plantation's premium fiber. They had no idea they were walking into a tomb. The overseer stepped through the doorway first, his eyes immediately drawn to the mill stones. "Jesus Christ," Jenkins whispered, his face going pale as he took in the carnage. Bits of fabric and worse things clung to the granite wheels, and the smell of death mixed with cotton dust filled the air. One of the visitors, a thin man with spectacles, vomited immediately upon seeing what remained of Master Coleman's distinctive blue coat wrapped around the mill stone. Isaac moved with the silence his size should have made impossible. His massive hands closed around Jenkins' throat before the overseer could draw breath to scream. The whip fell from nerveless fingers as Isaac lifted the man off his feet, Jenkins' boots kicking frantically in the air. "Where are the others?" Isaac hissed into the dying man's ear. "How many more know you came here?" But Jenkins could only gurgle, his eyes bulging with terror and lack of air. Isaac squeezed harder until something snapped, then fed the overseer's body to the mill stones that accepted all offerings without judgment. The 3 visitors tried to run simultaneously, crashing into each other in the doorway like terrified sheep. Isaac caught the nearest one, a fat merchant whose gold watch chain clinked as he struggled. "Please don't kill me," the man sobbed. "I have money, lots of money." Isaac's grip tightened on the man's shirt. "Did you know what they planned to do to my child?" he demanded. The merchant's confused terror told Isaac everything he needed to know. These were just buyers, innocent of the specific crime, but complicit in the system that made such crimes possible. The moral calculation took Isaac less than a second. These men would spread word of what they had seen, would bring every sheriff and slave catcher in 3 states down on Riverside Plantation. His wife and unborn child's safety depended on their silence, and dead men told no tales. Isaac fed the fat merchant to the mill with mechanical efficiency, then caught the second visitor, a young man barely out of his teens who begged in a voice that cracked with fear. "I never owned slaves," the young man cried. "I'm just learning the cotton trade." Isaac paused, something in the boy's voice reminding him of his younger brother, sold away when Isaac was 15. But sentiment was a luxury he could not afford. The mill stones claimed the young cotton buyer as they had claimed his elders, grinding away another witness to Isaac's rebellion. The last visitor had made it furthest from the mill house, but Isaac's long legs covered ground faster than the older man's desperate scramble. Isaac caught him just outside the building, his massive hands gentle despite their deadly purpose. "I'm sorry," Isaac said quietly, meaning it. Then the mill stones sang their crushing song one final time, and silence fell over the plantation like a shroud. 7 bodies now lay pulped beneath the grinding wheels, mixed with cotton fiber that would never become cloth. Isaac stood alone in the mill house, breathing hard, his clothes soaked with sweat and blood. Outside, the plantation continued its morning routine, unaware that its entire power structure had just been ground to dust. But Isaac knew his time was running shorter with each passing moment. Someone would notice Jenkins' absence, would come looking for the missing cotton buyers, would discover the charnel house he had made of their precious mill. Isaac walked to the mill controls and did something he had never done in 7 years of operation. He shut down the machinery. The great stones groaned to a halt, their eternal grinding finally silenced after consuming their strangest harvest. In that sudden quiet, Isaac could hear birds singing in the distance, children playing in the slave quarters, the normal sounds of a plantation morning that would soon become screams of terror and calls for vengeance. He needed to reach Miriam, needed to warn her, needed to hold her one last time before the inevitable end came crashing down on them both. But as Isaac stepped out of the mill house, he saw something that filled him with both hope and dread. Miriam was walking toward him across the cotton field, her hand resting on her swollen belly, concern etched on her beautiful face. She had heard the mill stop and come to investigate, not knowing she was walking toward the scene of the greatest slave rebellion in Mississippi history. "Isaac," she called out, her voice carrying across the field. "What happened? Why did the mill stop?" Isaac started running toward her, his long strides eating up the distance between them. But he could see other figures moving in the plantation grounds now. House slaves peering out of windows, field hands looking up from their work, all drawn by the unnatural silence where the mill's grinding should have been. Discovery was moments away, and with it would come a manhunt that would end only in death. Isaac reached Miriam and swept her into his arms, lifting her off her feet despite her pregnant condition. "We have to go," he whispered urgently into her ear. "Right now. Don't ask questions, just trust me." But Miriam pulled back, her eyes searching his face, seeing the blood spatters on his clothes, the wild desperation in his eyes. "Isaac, what have you done?" she asked, her voice trembling with a fear that had nothing to do with physical danger, and everything to do with the certainty that their world had just ended. Before Isaac could answer, a scream erupted from the direction of the mill house. A house slave named Timothy had discovered the carnage, his voice rising in panic and horror as he called for help. The sound cut across the plantation like a blade, and Isaac watched as every head turned toward the mill, every face registering the wrongness in Timothy's cry. Within minutes, the entire plantation would know that something terrible had happened in the mill house. Within hours, every white man in Mississippi would be hunting for the slave who had dared to kill his masters. Isaac grabbed Miriam's hand and started pulling her toward the woods that bordered the eastern edge of the plantation. If they could reach the tree line, if they could follow the creek bed toward the river, maybe they could find a boat, maybe they could reach the free territories up north. It was a desperate plan with almost no chance of success, but it was the only hope they had. Behind them, more voices joined Timothy's screams, a chorus of terror and disbelief that grew louder with each passing second. But Miriam couldn't run fast enough, her pregnant belly making flight impossible. After 50 yards, she stopped, breathing hard, her hand pressed to her side. "Isaac, I can't," she gasped. "The baby, something's wrong." Isaac looked down and saw blood seeping through her dress, dark stains that meant their child was in danger, that the stress and exertion had triggered something that could kill them both. His choice was brutal in its simplicity: abandon his wife to save himself, or stay and face certain death together. Isaac swept Miriam up in his arms, carrying her toward the tree line as shouts erupted behind them. The plantation was fully alert now, voices calling for arms, for horses, for the dogs that would track them through the swamp. But as Isaac ran with his wife's bleeding form in his arms, he felt something he had not expected: peace. For the first time in his life, he had acted not as property but as a man. He had protected his family the only way the system allowed, with violence that matched the violence done to them. Whether he lived or died in the next few hours mattered less than the fact that he had finally struck back. The tree line was only 20 yards away when the first shot rang out behind them. Isaac felt the musket ball whistle past his ear, heard it thud into a pine tree ahead. More shots followed, a ragged volley from the house slaves who had been armed to stop their escape. Isaac zigzagged between the trees, Miriam's weight seeming to disappear as adrenaline flooded his system. Another few yards and they would be in the deep woods, where the horses couldn't follow, where the dogs would lose their scent in the creek water. But as Isaac crashed through the underbrush, Miriam's body went limp in his arms. He looked down to see her eyes fluttering closed, blood soaking through her dress in quantities that meant internal bleeding, meant their child was dying inside her, meant that his rebellion had cost him everything he had tried to protect. "Miriam," he called, but her head lolled back, unconscious, her breathing shallow and rapid. The sound of pursuing horses grew louder behind them, but Isaac no longer cared about escape. The only thing that mattered now was finding a place where Miriam could give birth, where their child might somehow survive even if they did not. Isaac found a small clearing beside the creek, hidden by fallen logs and thick undergrowth. He laid Miriam gently on a bed of moss, her face pale as cotton, her breathing labored. Blood continued to seep from her body, and Isaac knew with the certainty of a man who had seen death many times that she was dying. But the child still moved in her belly, still fought for life despite everything that had happened. Isaac pressed his ear to Miriam's stomach and heard a faint but steady heartbeat, proof that something innocent might yet emerge from this day of blood and vengeance. The barking grew closer as Isaac knelt beside Miriam in their hidden clearing, her contractions coming faster now despite the blood loss that was slowly taking her life. Each spasm racked her small frame, and Isaac found himself remembering his mother's words from long ago: "Birth and death dance together, child. Sometimes they waltz, sometimes they fight." Tonight they were locked in mortal combat, with his unborn baby caught between them. Isaac had helped birth calves and foals on the plantation, but human birth was different, more dangerous, especially when the mother was dying from internal bleeding. Miriam's breathing came in short gasps, her face gray as winter sky, but her eyes remained focused on his face with desperate love. "Promise me," she whispered between contractions. "Promise me you'll tell our baby about me, not how I died but how I lived, how I loved you both." Isaac's throat closed around words he couldn't speak, promises he might not live to keep. The sound of horses crashing through underbrush told Isaac the pursuers were close, maybe 2 minutes away. But Miriam's labor wouldn't wait for a convenient moment. Her body was expelling their child whether it was safe or not, whether Isaac was ready or not, whether they would all die in the attempt or not. Isaac positioned himself to catch the baby, his massive hands surprisingly gentle as he prepared to bring new life into a world that had already condemned it to death. "I see the head," Isaac whispered, wonder breaking through his terror. Despite everything, the blood, the pursuit, the certain doom approaching, their child was fighting to be born, to draw breath, to live. The baby's skull appeared, covered in blood and birth fluid, but unmistakably alive, unmistakably perfect. Isaac cupped his hands around the tiny head, guiding it as Miriam pushed with strength she didn't have, spending her last reserves of life to give their child a chance at existence. The horses were so close now Isaac could hear individual voices calling out orders. "Spread out. Check every tree. He can't have gone far carrying the woman." But Isaac blocked out the sounds of pursuit, focused entirely on the miracle happening in his hands. The baby's shoulders appeared, then its body, slippery and warm and crying with the outraged voice of the newly born. A son, Isaac realized, a perfect son who would never know slavery if Isaac had anything to say about it. Isaac cleared the baby's mouth with his finger, watching as the tiny chest began moving with independent breath. The cord still connected mother to child, the last physical bond between them, but Isaac knew he had to cut it quickly. Using his teeth, he severed the umbilical cord and tied it off, his hands moving with surprising certainty. The baby's cries grew stronger, a sound so beautiful it made Isaac's heart break with the knowledge that he would likely hear it for only a few more minutes. Miriam's eyes found her son, and for a moment her face blazed with joy that transcended pain and approaching death. "He's beautiful," she breathed, reaching out with trembling fingers to touch the baby's cheek. "He has your eyes, Isaac, your strength." But even as she spoke, Isaac could see life fading from her face, could feel her hand growing colder in his. The birth had taken everything she had left, and now death was claiming its payment. The dogs burst into the clearing first, 3 bloodhounds baying with triumph at having found their quarry. Behind them came 6 white men on horseback, led by Sheriff Morrison, a hard man with dead eyes who had built his reputation on hunting runaway slaves. They pulled up short when they saw the scene. Isaac kneeling beside his dying wife, holding their newborn son, surrounded by evidence of birth and approaching death. For a moment, even these hardened men seemed affected by the human drama playing out before them. "Isaac of Riverside Plantation," Sheriff Morrison called out, his voice carrying across the clearing with official authority. "You're under arrest for the murder of 7 white men. Come quietly and we'll make it quick." But Isaac didn't move, didn't acknowledge the sheriff's words. His attention was entirely focused on Miriam, who was using her last breath to whisper something in his ear. "Live," she said, so quietly only he could hear. "Live for him, live for me, live free." Then she was gone, her eyes closing for the final time, her hand falling away from their son's face. Isaac felt something fundamental break inside his chest, felt the last chain that bound him to hope snap under the weight of loss. But the baby still cried in his arms, still demanded attention and protection and love. Isaac looked down at his son, not Master Coleman's, not property to be bought and sold, but his own flesh and blood, and made a decision that surprised even him. "Sheriff," Isaac called out, his voice carrying clearly across the clearing, "I'll come with you on one condition." Morrison leaned forward in his saddle, interested despite himself. "What condition?" Isaac stood slowly, the baby cradled against his chest, and when he spoke his voice carried the authority of a man who had nothing left to lose. "This child goes to free people, not sold, not enslaved, not raised as property. You find free black folks to take him, or I fight you here and now, and some of you don't ride home." The sheriff's laugh was harsh as winter wind. "You're hardly in a position to make demands, boy. You killed 7 white men. You're going to hang, and that baby's going back to the plantation where it belongs." But Isaac's response stopped the laughter cold. "That baby belongs to no one but itself, and I've got nothing left to lose, which makes me the most dangerous man in Mississippi right now." To prove his point, Isaac shifted the baby to his left arm and picked up a heavy fallen branch with his right. At 6'4" and built like a giant, he presented a formidable figure even surrounded by armed men. More importantly, the desperation in his eyes told every man present that he would fight to the death if they tried to enslave his child. The horses shifted nervously, sensing the tension, while the dogs continued to bark at the scent of blood and birth. Sheriff Morrison studied Isaac carefully, weighing his options. A fight here would likely cost him men, and dead deputies meant questions from judges and politicians. But more than that, something in Isaac's demeanor commanded respect. even from a man who made his living hunting slaves. This wasn't a cowering runaway begging for mercy. This was a father defending his child with the fury of a man who had already accepted his own death. "You killed Coleman," Morrison said finally, "and Bradley and the others. Why?" Isaac's answer came without hesitation. "They planned to sell my son to New Orleans the day he was born, planned to rip him from his mother's arms and ship him away like cargo. You tell me, Sheriff, what would you do if someone threatened to steal your child?" The question hung in the air like gunpowder smoke, and for a moment Morrison's face showed something that might have been understanding. But understanding didn't change the law, didn't alter the economic reality of a world built on slavery, didn't make Isaac anything other than property that had killed its owners. Morrison's voice hardened again. "Doesn't matter what I do. You're slaves, all of you. That baby's worth money, and money doesn't go free just because its daddy went crazy." He turned to his deputies. "Take the child. Shoot Isaac if he resists." That's when Isaac played his final card, the one he had been saving since the moment he crushed Master Coleman in the mill. "Before you do that, Sheriff, you might want to know about the others." Morrison's head snapped up, sudden attention focused on Isaac's words. "What others?" Isaac's smile was cold as January. "You think I only killed 7 men. You think I stopped with the mill." The lie came easily because it contained a grain of truth. Isaac had indeed killed 7 men, but his claim suggested a wider rebellion, other slaves rising up, other masters dead in their beds. In a region where white people lived in constant fear of slave revolt, the suggestion carried weight far beyond its actual truth. Morrison's face went pale as he considered the implications of a coordinated uprising across multiple plantations. "How many?" Morrison demanded, his voice tight with fear. Isaac's answer was deliberately vague. "Enough, and there's more planned for tonight if word gets out about what happened to me and my son." It was a complete fabrication, but Isaac sold it with the conviction of a man who had nothing left to lose. "You kill me, Sheriff, you hang me publicly, and every slave in 3 counties will know it's time to rise up. How many white families you willing to sacrifice for one dead baby?" The psychological warfare worked better than Isaac had dared hope. Morrison and his deputies exchanged nervous glances, suddenly seeing threats in every shadow, imagining armed slaves behind every tree. The sheriff's voice dropped to a whisper as he asked, "What do you want?" Isaac's answer was simple. "Safe passage for my son to free territory. Someone you trust to take him north, raise him free. Do that and I'll come with you quiet. Refuse, and tonight Mississippi burns." It was the bluff of a lifetime, staked on nothing more than white fear and parental love. Isaac stood in that forest clearing, his dead wife at his feet, his newborn son in his arms, and negotiated the terms of his own execution with men who could have shot him down like a dog. But something in his bearing, some quality of absolute determination, made them believe his lies about wider rebellion and coordinated revenge. Sheriff Morrison made his decision with the cold calculation of a man who valued his own life above abstract principles. "There's a freed slave named Sarah Washington, runs a station on the Underground Railroad up near Natchez. She takes in children, helps them get north." He paused, clearly hating every word. "I'll see the baby gets to her, but you come with us now, no more tricks, no more threats." Isaac looked down at his son, still crying in his arms, still fighting for life with the determination he had inherited from both parents. The baby's eyes were open now, dark and alert, seeming to study Isaac's face as if memorizing it. "Listen to me," Isaac whispered to his child, knowing these might be his only words to reach across the years. "Your mama was the strongest woman in Mississippi. Your daddy killed 7 men to protect you. You come from fighters, son. Don't you ever forget that." He kissed his son's forehead, breathing in the scent of new life and infinite possibility, then handed the baby to Sheriff Morrison with hands that shook for the first time all day. "His name is Freedom," Isaac said quietly. "Freedom Isaac Washington. Make sure Sarah knows that." Morrison nodded curtly, suddenly uncomfortable with the weight of the child in his arms, the responsibility of carrying innocence away from its father's fate. As the sheriff's men bound Isaac's hands behind his back, he felt an unexpected peace settle over his spirit. He had done something unprecedented in the annals of slavery. He had negotiated the freedom of his child through nothing but bluff and determination. His son would grow up in the North, would never know chains or whips or the casual cruelty of owners who saw people as livestock. The mill stones had ground more than cotton that day. They had ground out a future that slavery could never reclaim. The ride back to Riverside Plantation took 2 hours, with Isaac bound and mounted on a deputy's horse while Sheriff Morrison carried baby Freedom in a makeshift sling. Other plantations they passed showed signs of heightened alert armed patrols, nervous overseers, slaves locked in their quarters despite the early hour. Isaac's bluff about widespread rebellion was becoming self-fulfilling prophecy as fear spread through the white community like wildfire. At Riverside, a crowd had gathered to see the slave who had dared murder his masters. The mill house stood open, its stones finally silent after consuming their human harvest. Someone had cleaned out the worst of the carnage, but blood stains remained on the granite, permanent reminders of the day the machinery of oppression had been turned against its operators. Isaac looked at those stains with satisfaction, knowing they would never completely fade, knowing they would remind every future mill operator of what had happened when one slave said, "Enough." The trial lasted exactly 1 hour, a formality that concluded with the inevitable sentence of death by hanging. But Isaac barely listened to the proceedings. His attention was focused on Sheriff Morrison, who sat in the back of the courthouse holding a sleeping baby, and on the promise that had been made in a forest clearing stained with birth and death. As the judge pronounced sentence, Isaac caught Morrison's eye and mouthed a single word: "Remember." 3 days later, Isaac stood on the scaffold erected in Riverside's town square, facing a crowd of hundreds who had come to see justice served on the slave who killed his betters. His hands were bound, but his back was straight, his head high. He had received word that morning delivered by Sheriff Morrison in a whisper that might have been respect, that baby Freedom had been safely delivered to Sarah, Washington, and was already on his way north via the Underground Railroad. The hangman asked if Isaac had any last words. He looked out over the sea of white faces, angry and afraid, gathered to watch him die, and then beyond them to the scattered black faces of slaves forced to witness this warning about the price of resistance. His voice carried clearly across the square when he spoke. "My name is Isaac. I was born a slave, but I die a free man. My son will grow up free because I chose to fight instead of bow. Remember that. All of you remember that." The rope tightened around his neck, but Isaac's last thought was not of death. It was of a baby crying with strong lungs in a forest clearing, of dark eyes that would see the world as a place of possibility rather than bondage, of a boy who would grow up knowing his father died standing rather than kneeling. The trap door opened, and Isaac fell into legend. In the years that followed, the story of Isaac and the mill stone spread through slave communities across the South like seeds on the wind. It grew in the telling, gained details and significance, became a touchstone for those who dreamed of freedom. Children born into bondage learned Isaac's name before they learned their master's, heard about the day one man turned the machinery of oppression into an instrument of justice. The mill at Riverside Plantation was eventually torn down, but the story lived on. And somewhere in the North, a boy named Freedom Isaac Washington grew to manhood never knowing chains, never bowing to masters, carrying within him the legacy of a father who chose love over life and turned mill stones into a song of liberation. The rebellion Isaac started with granite and determination lived on in his son's free breath, proof that sometimes the deepest victory comes not from survival, but from the courage to sacrifice everything for what matters most. If this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and share it with others who need to hear these forgotten truths. Hit the bell icon for notifications, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. These stories matter because they remind us that ordinary people can do extraordinary things when they choose courage over safety, love over fear, and freedom over survival. 23 years after Isaac's death, a tall man with dark eyes and calloused hands stepped off a riverboat in Natchez, Mississippi. He carried himself with quiet confidence, his free papers folded carefully in his coat pocket, his father's story burning in his heart like an unquenchable flame. Freedom Isaac Washington had returned to the land of his birth, but not as the helpless infant who had been carried away in a sheriff's arms. He came back as an educated man, a conductor on the Underground Railroad, and the son of a legend who intended to finish what his father had started. Sarah Washington had raised Freedom well in the North, telling him every detail she knew about Isaac's sacrifice, about the millstones that had crushed 7 masters, about the love that had driven a slave to bargain with death itself for his child's future. But Sarah had also taught him patience, strategy, and the dangerous art of moving through slave territory while appearing to belong. Freedom had spent 5 years learning the river routes, memorizing safe houses, building networks of trust that stretched from New Orleans to Canada. Now he was putting that knowledge to use in the most personal mission of his life. The Riverside Plantation still operated under new ownership, the Hendricks family having purchased it from Coleman's estate after no white family would live in the house where Isaac's victims had been crushed. The mill had been rebuilt, its stones imported from Georgia to replace the blood-stained granite that had become too notorious to use. But the slave quarters remained the same, housing new generations of bondage, including some who still whispered Isaac's name when the overseers weren't listening. Freedom had spent months in New Orleans learning everything he could about current conditions at Riverside. The plantation now held 147 enslaved people, including 32 children under the age of 12. Master James Hendricks was considered a relatively moderate owner, but moderation in slavery still meant whips, chains, and families torn apart whenever profit demanded. What interested Freedom most was a piece of information that made his blood sing with possibility. Among the current slaves was an old man named Samuel, who claimed to have worked alongside Isaac in the original mill. Finding Samuel proved easier than expected. The old man, now in his 70s and bent with arthritis, still worked in the rebuilt mill despite his age. Freedom approached him during the noon rest, when the machinery fell silent and the workers gathered in whatever shade they could find. "Uncle Samuel," Freedom said quietly, using the respectful address that would draw no attention from watching overseers. "I heard you knew my father." Samuel's head snapped up, his cloudy eyes focusing on Freedom's face with sudden intensity. The family resemblance was unmistakable. Freedom had inherited Isaac's height and build, the same strong jaw and penetrating gaze that had once faced down a sheriff in a forest clearing. Samuel's voice trembled when he spoke. "Lord have mercy, you got to be Isaac's boy. You got his eyes, child. His spirit standing right there in front of me." Other mill workers began to gather, drawn by the electricity in Samuel's voice, sensing that something momentous was happening in their midst. "Tell me about him," Freedom said simply, and Samuel's weathered face broke into the first genuine smile it had worn in years. For the next hour, while the master's family ate their leisurely dinner, Samuel painted a picture of Isaac that went beyond Sarah Washington's second-hand stories. He described Isaac's gentleness with new workers, his knowledge of every sound the mill stones made, his quiet pride in providing for Miriam. But most importantly, Samuel revealed something no one in the North had known. Isaac had hidden detailed maps of escape routes throughout the slave quarters before his final day. "Your daddy was planning something bigger than just killing those masters," Samuel whispered, glancing around to make sure they weren't overheard. "He'd been working for months, maybe years, mapping every road, every river crossing, every safe house between here and free territory. Drew it all on pieces of birch bark and hid them in places only us mill workers knew about. But then they forced his hand with that business about selling you, and he never got to use his maps." Freedom's heart raced as Samuel led him to a loose stone in the mill foundation, reaching inside to pull out a piece of bark wrapped in oiled cloth. The map was still legible after more than 2 decades, Isaac's careful handwriting marking distances, safe houses, and danger points along multiple escape routes. But more than that, the bark contained something that made Freedom's eyes fill with tears, A letter addressed to my son, if God wills that you should read this. The letter was brief but profound, written in the careful script of a man who had taught himself to read by candlelight. Son, if you are reading this, then you grew up free as I prayed you would. I hope you never know chains or whips or the weight of another man's will press down on your spirit. But if you choose to help others find freedom, know that your daddy mapped the way. These routes are good, tested by men who made it through. But more than roads, remember this. Freedom isn't just about escaping slavery. It's about choosing to live as a human being instead of as property. I chose to fight, and that choice made me free even before I died. Choose well, my son. Your loving father, Isaac. Freedom folded the letter with hands that shook with emotion and purpose. His father hadn't just died to save one child. He had been planning to liberate entire populations, had spent years preparing escape routes that could guide hundreds to freedom. The millstones that crushed 7 masters had been only the beginning of a larger rebellion that Isaac's death had cut short. Now, 23 years later, his son had the opportunity to complete that unfinished work. But freedom didn't intend to simply follow his father's roots. He planned to improve them, expand them, and use them to orchestrate the largest slave escape in Mississippi history. Over the following weeks, working with Samuel and other trusted slaves, Freedom began laying groundwork for an operation that would dwarf anything the Underground Railroad had previously attempted. They would move not just individuals or families, but entire communities, using Isaac's maps as the foundation for a network that could evacuate hundreds of people in coordinated waves. The plan was audacious in its scope and complexity. Freedom had brought gold from northern abolitionists, enough to bribe river boat captains and purchase supplies for a journey that would take 3 weeks to complete. He had arranged for wagons to be waiting at predetermined points, for safe houses to be stocked with food and medicine, for trusted conductors to guide groups along parallel routes that would confuse pursuing slave catchers. Most importantly, he had brought something his father never possessed: the backing of a sophisticated organization with resources and connections throughout the free states. The logistics were staggering. 147 people couldn't simply disappear overnight without triggering a manhunt that would bring every sheriff and militia unit in 3 states down on their heads. They would have to move in carefully coordinated groups, leaving at different times, taking different routes, with elaborate systems of communication and misdirection to throw off pursuit. Some would go by river, hidden in the holds of sympathetic steamboat captains. Others would travel overland through swampland that would bog down horses, but could be navigated by people who knew the secret paths. Freedom spent long nights in the slave quarters, using his father's maps to brief group leaders on their assigned routes. The old mill worker Samuel proved invaluable, his intimate knowledge of local geography helping to refine Isaac's 2-decade-old intelligence. But the real breakthrough came when Freedom discovered that several of the safe houses marked on his father's maps were still operating, run by the same families or their descendants, maintained across generations by people who had never forgotten Isaac's sacrifice. The escape began on August 15, 1791, exactly 23 years to the day after Isaac had turned the mill stones into instruments of justice. The symmetry was intentional, Freedom's way of honoring his father's memory while completing his father's work. The first group of 20 people slipped away just after midnight, using Samuel's knowledge of guard rotations to avoid the plantation's night watch. They carried packs of food and clothing that Freedom had cached along their route, moving with the confidence of people who knew exactly where they were going. By dawn, when the plantation horn sounded to wake the workers, 63 slaves had vanished without a trace. The remaining groups would leave over the next 4 nights, their departures timed to create maximum confusion and prevent effective pursuit. Master Hendricks woke to find empty cabins, abandoned workstations, and a mill that couldn't operate without its experienced workers. But more shocking than the escape itself was what the fleeing slaves had left behind: A message written in charcoal on the mill house wall. Thank you for keeping our father's promise alive. The son of Isaac has come home. Tell all masters, the millstones remember and freedom calls. It was signed simply FIW, Freedom Isaac Washington, claiming his heritage and announcing his intention to finish what Isaac had started. The message sent terror through the white community, reviving memories of the day one slave had crushed 7 masters and turned the natural order of their world upside down. The manhunt that followed was the largest in Mississippi history, but freedom had anticipated every move. While posses searched obvious routes to the north, his people traveled through carefully scouted swampland to the east, following paths that Isaac had mapped decades earlier. River boats carried some groups south toward New Orleans before turning north on the Mississippi, confusing trackers who expected all movement to be toward free territory. Within 2 weeks, all 147 former slaves had crossed into free states, the largest single escape in the history of American slavery. The success sent shockwaves through the South. If it could happen at Riverside, if one man could evacuate an entire plantation using nothing but careful planning and his father's 2-decade-old maps, then no slave owner was safe. Panic spread through plantation communities as masters realized that the docile workers they thought they knew might be planning similar mass escapes. Security increased dramatically, but so did the stories whispered in slave quarters about Isaac's son, and the freedom that could be won through courage and organization. Freedom never returned to Mississippi, but his legend grew alongside his father's. Together, father and son became symbols of different types of resistance. Isaac representing the fierce individual defiance that would accept death before submission, freedom embodying the patient, strategic approach that could liberate entire communities. The mill at Riverside Plantation was eventually abandoned, its owners unable to find workers willing to operate machinery that carried such powerful associations with rebellion and justice. Years later, when Freedom Isaac Washington died peacefully in Canada, surrounded by children and grandchildren who had never known bondage, his funeral was attended by hundreds of people whose freedom traced back to that August night, when one man's careful planning liberated an entire plantation. Among them were descendants of the original Riverside slaves, now teachers and farmers and business owners who carried their own children's freedom as Isaac's greatest legacy. The millstones at Riverside have long since crumbled into dust, but the story they tell continues to echo through generations. A father who chose love over life, crushing his oppressors with the very machinery they used to grind down the human spirit. A son who transformed that sacrifice into systematic liberation, using intelligence and patience to complete what violence had begun. Together, they proved that freedom isn't just something to be granted or denied by others. It's something to be claimed by those brave enough to reach out and take it, no matter what the cost. If their story inspires you to learn more about the hidden heroes of American history, subscribe to our channel and share this video with others who need to hear these truths. The millstones may be gone, but their song of liberation continues in every person who chooses to stand up rather than bow down, to fight rather than submit, to love rather than hate. That song is the true inheritance Isaac left his son, and the legacy that continues to echo across the centuries.